In my last video, I talked about why I'm not a feminist. In this video, I'm going to talk about why I'm an anti-feminist. So, what's the difference? Well, being not a feminist is simply the state of not having adopted and not having begun to act on or not being guided by feminist ideology, feminist beliefs, feminist activism. So, not being a feminist isn't specifically an action, it's more of an inaction. I'm not a feminist because I never had a reason to become a feminist. Being an anti-feminist, on the other hand, is a more active thing. It comes from having looked at feminist beliefs and feminist promotion of ideas, particularly ideas about men and women, and the activism feminists have engaged in with respect to legal changes and rejecting those beliefs and opposing those legal changes. So for me, being an anti-feminist means more than simply not being a feminist. It means arguing against feminists. It means arguing against the legal changes. It means directly opposing those legal changes. So then the question becomes, what took me from the condition of simply not adopting feminism to the point where I decided to oppose feminism? And the answer to that goes all the way back to high school. Back in the late 80s, when I was a high school student, the public face of feminism began to crack, letting hatred for men start to show through the girl power mask of the 70s. I started seeing gender used as an argument for whether or not something someone had observed was legitimate. The worst of that at the time happened in academia. I was attending classes with my father. Now, I wasn't part of the class. I was just there as a high school student observing how a college class was conducted. And one of the things I observed there was some of the younger students, just a few years older than me, using as an argument in class against observations my father made about the class material and its application in the real world, while you're just a middle-aged, middle-class, white male oppressor. What do you know? At 17 years old, surrounded by teenagers who use arguments like, everybody's doing it, to legitimize irrational behavior, I think that statement actually was the most irrational thing I had ever heard. I continued to see behavior like that on university campuses every place I went to observe university life. And it actually kind of turned me off a little bit to higher education. But, of course, I ended up going anyway. In the meantime, I began to learn where these ideas originated, where these behaviors originated, and it did trace back to feminism and what today we would call social justice mentalities. Back then, I think it was more referred to as political correctness. But political correctness also stemmed to a degree from feminism. Not solely from feminism, but enough that it caused a second look at what feminism was all about. Now, that didn't lead me to actively oppose feminism, but it was definitely an aspect of feminism for me to argue against. It is ridiculous to say that somebody's perspective can delegitimize their observations about the world around them. It was about that time that the Riot Girl phenomenon kicked in. And I became aware of the Riot Girl phenomenon through an article in 17 magazine. It was essentially promoting this phenomenon as a girl power thing. But when you read into it, the more you looked at the movement, it really was a manifestation of resentment over being told no for any reason and attributing those experiences to one's gender. A prime example of that was actually in the article in which one of the Riot Girls complained that people didn't let girls be in bands. I'm sitting there reading this, thinking about the Go-Go's and going, well, wait a minute, there are girl bands, and there was Joan Jett, there was Lita Ford, there were girl phenomena in the music industry. And the idea that girls were prevented from doing things because of their gender was kind of bullshit. And I recognized that at the time. And I thought, what are these girls on? So if I hadn't already been turned off to feminism, that would have done it. There was more to the story of Riot Girls. If you look them up, it really was kind of a mix of, we want to be tough, but we want to have something to complain about. And it really was kind of ridiculous. You could consider it to be a predecessor to slut walking, because they used to dress in skimpy clothes and write nasty things about women upon their skin, with the idea that, this is what people think of us and this is what people say to us, and shame on them for having those thoughts and so on. Where in reality, girls really didn't face any more of that then than they do today. And it usually wasn't in response to them just being girls. It usually had to do with reflections of their character. If you act like a bitch and somebody calls you a bitch, you haven't been discriminated against on the basis of your gender. You've been called out for bad behavior. So right in the beginning, I had political correctness being shoved down people's throats and the riot girl phenomenon to show me that feminism was stupid. Then I went to college. And I was fortunate. I didn't go to a state school. I went to a smaller private school, not really one of the more expensive private schools, but still a small campus where there were some differences from the bigger universities. It wasn't a party school. In fact, it was a dry campus. And the fact that it was a dry campus made it all that much more surprising to run into alcohol-related consent training as part of my orientation. Now, they didn't call it that. I don't remember what they did call it, but the word consent wasn't really being used in terms of the discussion on university campuses at the time. I think they actually called it rape prevention. The gist of it was the same as today's training on alcohol-related consent. The idea that women are uniquely incapable of consenting to sex after consuming any alcohol. The same consideration was not given to men. It really bothered me watching that and seeing that the rules did not go both ways. Some of my first arguments on the internet were over that, actually, that the rules on alcohol-related consent didn't go both ways. That if a couple got drunk together, neither one of them passed out, neither one of them was stumbling blind drunk, both of them were just a little bit tipsy, and they had sex, the guy was responsible, but the girl was considered unable to consent. And I would get this argument from feminists, and I would say, I thought feminism was about equality. If you're not treating both sexes equally in this circumstance, then how can you say that it's about equality? And of course the response was, you don't understand equality. So now we're looking at the early 90s, the time period when it was still expensive as heck to get online. If you didn't have a connection through your university or your job, most of your internet stuff was actually done offline, and then you would get online long enough to copy and paste and send, and then you would go back offline again. You didn't go visiting websites, you didn't spend a lot of time on internet forums unless you were direct dialing, because if you went through an internet service, then you're paying through the nose. And during that point in time, feminism's primary narrative became the victim narrative. In fact, it was almost entirely about intimate partner and sexual violence. That was about the time that Take Back the Night rallies became a thing, too. And those were a lot like church revivals. And I've been to both, Take Back the Night rallies and tent revivals, and they both have a lot of the same components. You have somebody standing up in front of the crowd, giving a rabble-rousing speech, supposed to be inspirational and at the same time compelling. And then you have the testimonials. And then you have the collection of money, or people signing up to volunteer for activism. And those are the three basic things that I saw happening at both. And in both cases, it seemed like the attendees were competing to give the best testimonial. And each one had to dramatize their experiences in order to do that. Each one involved demonization of an enemy. Now, of course, at church revivals, the enemy is the devil. So it's not too hard to demonize there. In Take Back the Night rallies, the enemy is men. You didn't see guys standing up and talking about their experiences. You saw women talking about this guy or that guy did this to me, and all men are like that. All men are bad. And it was very much a method of convincing women that it's okay to have some hatred for men, even though it's not. At that time, you could say my anti-feminism was really limited to rejection and criticism. There really wasn't anything I was actively doing, aside from having been a part of the Right to Life movement, that would constitute direct, open opposition. Then there were more news stories. First, there was the university campus, where feminist students put wanted posters up. Wanted potential rapist, with guys from their campus who hadn't actually been accused of anything pictured on the posters. And there was a huge controversy over that. At the same time as that was going on, news stories started to be published regarding the promotion of a new Violence Against Women Act, referencing research, not by citing a scientific journal or medical journals or even journals on domestic violence or family law or anything like that, but Ms. Magazine. One of the best articles on the topic was the Toledo Blade's Rape, the Making of an Epidemic, which combined the whole story together, not just the bit that was published in Ms. Magazine, but all of the discussions that were taking place at the time with respect to sexual violence, the prevalence of sexual violence, and what approach should be taken for prevention and so on. I do recommend reading that article, and of course I will have it referenced in the low bar of this video. My takeaway from it was that the conflict over this law and the promotion of the law itself didn't have anything to do with whether or not women needed to be protected from sexual violence, but whether or not feminists had the right to define for all women what the standards were for consent. I didn't really like the idea of a bunch of other women making decisions for me in regards to my sex life. I thought that was grade A bullshit, and I still do. One of the biggest problems I had with it, though, was the gendered nature of the discussion. They talked about what happens to women, they never looked into what happens to men. And they talked about it as though only men did it. They never looked into whether or not women were doing it too. So I started looking into a little bit of the history of it, and I discovered there was already domestic violence law. And I figured there was, because I knew there were domestic violence victim shelters. I also knew that men could be abused, because I had a friend whose wife, when she was angry, not only would yell and scream and throw temper tantrums and hit him, but actually throw small appliances and light fixtures at him. So this idea that domestic violence and sexual violence were being talked about in terms of gendered rights and gendered responses and gendered responsibility, that just didn't fly with me. And it became a reason for me to actively oppose legislation. Now, Violence Against Women Act passed, and the domestic violence law that had been gender neutral went by the wayside. But during that time, I cut my teeth on arguing with feminists and writing to legislators about this issue. And saw my first situation of feminists pushing discriminatory law through just by the force of their own will and their own arguments and their own exploitation of gynocentrism. At the time, I didn't have a word to describe gynocentrism. I understood the concept. I knew that feminists were using society's benevolent and protective attitude towards women as their tool to do this. And I knew that they were lying about things in order to make it happen. But it took me years to be able to effectively articulate that. Now, at that time, I wouldn't have necessarily called myself a men's rights activist. My opposition of feminism, while I was opposed to their demonization of men, And while I was opposed to their lobby for discriminatory law, was largely based on my opposition to their description of women as weak and stupid and vulnerable, and at the same time strong and equal to men. You can't be both. And I really took massive issue with the victim narrative and with the way it was being used. It really was more anti-feminism than men's rights activism at that time. I'd love to tell you what changed that, but that's not what this video is about. That's the next one. So you'll have to stay tuned, and I will try not to make it quite as long in between this one and the next one. My next video will be what inspired me to become a men's rights activist.